Is very selfish. I want to document the stuff that goes through in my head and put it online and put it out there, so in case someone tries to prove that they defined mindset before I did, I can go back and, because this shit never leaves the internet, I can prove it. So this is for my benefit. But because you guys are CrossFitters, I have tried my best to define what mindset is, because when you talk about mindset, it's like, wicked, I'll come to a mindset seminar, what the fuck is it? Yeah, what the fuck is it? And I think Coach Greg Classman, because we are CrossFitters, I think you guys will relate to this quite well. What Greg Classman did in the CrossFit world, yeah, or actually in the fitness world, yeah, is he was lucky enough, no, not lucky enough, he was intelligent enough to define what fitness is. So if you say fitness to someone, how do you describe fitness? How do you define fitness? Like, it's a very broad term, right? Yeah. So same principle applies to mindset. How do you define mindset? Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it good? Is it positive? Same thing with fitness. Are you fit? Are you not fit? You kind of see the correlation there. So what I tried to do is I tried to break down his approach and figure out how we can define mindset, because I think if we define mindset, then it gives you kind of something to work towards. Otherwise, we don't really know what we're working towards. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and when Coach Greg Classman was going through and figuring out how to define what fitness is, and I need to write these up, right? He defines fitness as, and I'm just going to use the F for force and distance for time. So what he was saying was that force times distance, okay, how much load we can carry for how long we can go, is kind of the prerequisite to starting to figure out how we define fitness. Does that make sense? Yeah. He then broke that down a little bit further, and he goes, well, force times distance equals power. Okay, power being, I'm not losing you guys here, we're following this, power being, right, how much fitness can you produce in one moment? Yeah. So if power equals force times distance, right, we want to divide it by time. You with me so far? So how much power I can put out, how much fitness I can put out, right, is directly related to how much load I can carry for how long, right, how quickly. Does that make sense? Yeah. The more load I can carry for the longer period of time, yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Equals how much fitness we're putting out. You following me so far? So then what he said was then, well, shit, if I can average this power, right, therefore, this part gets tricky, right? Therefore, the intensity of my fitness, how much intensity I can bring, right, is the average power. I'll get rid of one of these. So average being how long over multiple days, yeah, can I produce the same level of fitness, right? Force times distance.
So how long you can sustain it?
How long you can sustain it, exactly, yeah? So this is one instance, yeah? We then break that down. Fitness is how many times can you now repeat this on average? On average, how can I keep the intensity up? Yeah, you might be able to do this one day a week. Yeah, and then next week try to hit that same level 2 times. Yeah, you've now increased your average fitness. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when I looked at this, I was like, wow, that was pretty clever. He just took a very broad term, mathematically broke it down to something that we can measure. Yeah. I wanted to then take that further, and if that's CrossFit or that's the fitness route, I wanted to see what we could do in terms of mindset. Now, the reason why I'm breaking this down and getting real technical with this is because I want to document, and this is very selfish, I want to document the stuff that goes through in my head and put it online and put it out there, so in case someone tries to prove that they defined mindset before I did, I can go back and, because this shit never leaves the internet, I can prove it. So this is for my benefit, but I think it's a really cool exercise for us to play with. Pretty cool, yeah? So when we look at this, and if force times distance is the first part of the equation when we're going through and we're doing our mindset stuff, what are we going to replace the force and the distance with here for mindset? What are we going to replace the force with? What's measurable? Any ideas? Mindfulness, yeah. Okay, let's go back a bit further. So if we're lifting weights, if that's our measure of fitness, right? Focus. Yeah. Focus. Yeah. Also, what about happiness? Yeah. If you've got a positive mindset, wouldn't you be happy? Is that what we're trying to be happy, right? Yeah. fitness, we kind of want to be able to move a little bit of weight, yeah? So that's the correlation that I made, yeah? Happiness we can measure, right? You can measure that, you know how you feel, right? Like focus is a little bit harder because it's where you focus in that moment, but you know when you're happy, just like you know that when you're lifting something. Does that make sense? Yeah? So I replaced this with happiness, okay? I don't know how to spell happiness, but we'll go with that. Cool? Yeah? Now, the next part that I did, right, is the distance part, okay? That one's pretty simple, right? Times, length of times, yeah, right? So times, instead of distance, and times time. But specifically for time, how many hours, yeah? Just to give it something that we can measure with. So if you take a 24-hour window, yeah, inside of that 24-hour window, which is a nice easy metric for us to figure out, yeah, how long are we happy? Yeah, how often were we happy in there? So then if we keep going and we're following Coach Greg Classman's formula down, right, and this is, we'll get through this boring bit in a second, yeah, then what would P be? And it almost spells it out itself. What would P be? Mindset, yep. When we try to have a good mindset, attitude, yep. Let's go black and white. Positive, negative? Yeah? Would you have a positive mindset and a negative mindset? Hey, yeah? Yeah? So if P being our fitness or our power output, right, it just happens that P is our positivity. Does that make sense? Yeah? So if P is our positivity, right, then our positivity, how positive we are about our mindset, is equals, right, force times distance, same formula, divided by time. So happiness, right, times however many hours we were happy for, divided by 24 hours in a day. Does that make sense? Yeah? You could almost measure that. If you had a diary and you wrote down in there every hour, right, I was happy. I was happy. You could even go H, S, I was sad, yeah? Little line for neutral. Imagine if you did that every day. Don't do that, right? But imagine if you did, yeah? And then you worked on your mindset, you'd have a direct way of measuring how happy you were or how positive your mindset was. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. Then, following the same rule, right? Same rule, 3 here. If you average that out, okay, same principle. Cool. If you average that out, now we're talking about this was one instance in one day, yeah? Then how often are you going to repeat that day in, day out, week in, week out? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? So then if we take a look at the formula, and rather than look at it like fucking algebra, if we were actually able to write that down, then all of a sudden, yeah, you could, into layman's terms, yeah, if, for a better word, right, on average, how positive you were, yeah, on average, how positive you were in a week, yeah, would equal how happy you were over how many hours over a 24-hour period. Does that make sense? Yeah? Cool. Do we follow that? And that's a metric. So we just took something that's very blasé, mindset, and turned it into something that if you wanted to, you could diarize it, put it down on paper, and actually measure it as a metric. Pretty cool? Yeah?